David, thanks so much for joining me. I'm going to ask you a very fundamental question, and I often ask this to my guests. Can you give me a philosophical history of the mind body problem? If you had to think about this entire history of it, how it's framed your views and your current view on consciousness and the mind body problem, what is the story you would tell?
Good. So, I mean, I've written quite a lot about the history of the mind-body problem, but not going back that far, only going back, well, I guess as far as Descartes, the scientific revolution. So I'm no expert on how the mind-body problem was before that, but starting with Descartes, you can see quite a simple sequence, I think. So there's Descartes. We all know Descartes' view. He's a dualist. There's the physical world. It's all mechanical. It's just matter in motion. And then in addition, for Descartes, there's the mental world and they and interact. He's an interactive dualist. The mind affects the body affects the mind. And that was kind of the default position in early modern philosophy with Descartes. But if you think let's get the dates right, from the middle of the 18th century, you have a movement towards idealism, and idealism becomes the dominant idea, at least in Western philosophy, and that carries on through into the 20th century. And if you're an idealist, there isn't really a mind-body problem. The physical realm has just been shuffled off to the side. And then idealism starts breaking down. And I'm, in fact, very interested. I haven't written about it, but I'm currently curious about the history of what goes on when it breaks down, because you have, especially in Germany, you have Kantians or neo-Kantians who kind of are basically idealists. The empirical world is the world of experience. But at the same time, they're starting to take seriously microphysical theories, the atomic theory of matter, kinetic theory of gases. They're doing a lot of physiology, and they really struggle to put the two perspectives together. Everything is constructed out of materials in the mind, but at the same time, it looks like the mind is just this bunch of neural processes. And the neural processes are part of the physical world that's constructed by the mind. There's a terrible, terrible tangle there. And we can go into details, but by the middle of the 20th century, the dominant view, I think, has become, and we can go into the reasons for this, that the physical world is primary. So we've had first of all, we had dualism. Both worlds are fundamental. Then we had idealism, just a mental world. Then we have a complete reversal, physicalism. There's just a physical world, and the mental world, to the extent it exists, of course it does, is part of the physical world. So that's how I see the history of the mind-body problem in Western philosophy since 1600.
I
There
think
you
it's
are.
always fascinating to see how someone comes to their own view of consciousness or the mind body problem
Mhm.
based on their history and what they've learned about it along the way. Um,
Mhm.
Something I'm particularly fascinated by, of course, you are firmly a materialist or physicalist, right? Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and within this realm, there's so many different theories of consciousness. Just recently, Robert Kuhn posted that wonderful taxonomy, and it's
I've seen that. In fact, I'm speaking to Robert. He's interviewing me, a conversation uh, in a couple of days, I think.
I'm speaking
He's,
to him in
you, you
early.
know, he's got a competitor podcast,
Yes,
and
yes. Look, I'm speaking to him in about I think early fall, but because
yeah,
my podcast was largely inspired by his podcast. I mean, I even told him that via email, so we're going to chat as well. I'll ask him about your conversation when the time comes. But he wrote this wonderful taxonomy, and your name's in there. It's mentioned, and it's interesting to see all these different theories of consciousness being discussed within this realm. It's becoming very popular, it seems, as well. But something that's very apparent from the get-go, and you look at that taxonomy, is that how many different physicalist theories of consciousness there are. So,
Yeah, yeah.
as a physicalist, what are your thoughts on this right now? Knowing that there's so many different thoughts. Some people think it's an electromagnetic field. Some people think it's brainwaves. Some people think it's an epiphenomena. There's so many different views. Illusionism. Where's your head at on these various physicalist theories?
I think many people in this area, people who think they're physicalists, take consciousness much too seriously in the sense they reify it as a kind of definite thing. And I think that a lot of the thinking in that line of business, especially, I mean, including all the scientists who are trying to develop some scientific theory of consciousness, they're implicitly, unknowingly motivated by thinking in a dualist way. And it comes out in the way they talk. They they say the problem is to explain how does the brain give rise to consciousness? How does it generate consciousness? As if, first of all, there's the brain, and then somehow there's this extra thing. Perhaps, comes on at a certain point of evolution. When did consciousness evolve? As if this is some extra bit of material reality that comes into existence. And I think that's taking consciousness much too seriously. I think actually they're thinking like dualists, they're thinking like Descartes. They think there's all the physical realm, and in addition, there's this extra stuff, and there's going to be a sharp point at which this extra stuff comes in existence, and we need a theory of what causes it. And I think that's all bad thinking. And to that extent, I'm quite sympathetic to illusionists. I mean, they're saying if that's what you think of consciousness is, there ain't no such thing. I mean, I'm very disinclined to say there's no consciousness. That sounds really silly. I mean, of course we're conscious. When we're awake, we're conscious. When we close our eyes, we lose our visual consciousness. We don't want to stop talking in those ways. But I think we're just talking about a certain aspect of our physical processing. And I'm rather suspicious that our everyday thinking about consciousness, phenomenal consciousness. I mean, Ned Block's very insistent it's phenomenal consciousness we're thinking, not some kind of functionally defined state. I don't think our everyday thinking of phenomenal consciousness, what it's like, is particularly precise. I don't think it picks out an important scientific category. I think it's a kind of loose way of referring to certain loosely defined brain processes in humans, and it's not clear that there's anything very definite that ties them together. It's not clear that the notion is tight enough for us to decide whether certain animals, octopuses, bees, lobsters, are they conscious? And coming soon, there's a question of which AI systems, if any, are conscious. And I don't think we ought to spend a lot of time agonizing about that question. I think when we start applying the notion of consciousness derived from our own states to these somewhat alien systems, I don't think it draws very sharp lines.
I think I agree with you that sympathy that you feel for illusionism. I don't think you know this, but I wrote my dissertation. Part of it, one of my theories of consciousness, one of the aspects was writing on theories of consciousness, and I wrote defending illusionism as a theory of consciousness. And I find,
was it Cape Town?
Sorry.
Was this at Cape Town?
Yeah, in Cape Town, South Africa. Yeah, and I spoke to Keith prior to this and during the course. Nicholas Humphrey, Mark Solms, we all sort of they pitched in and assisted me, and so I gave them thanks in my dissertation. But so I just spoke to Keith the other day, and we were discussing. We spoke for nearly 5 hours. First, we did a full podcast, and then I allowed Keith to do a full lecture for the show. So that's going to come out soon. But we were just chatting about how people don't understand what illusionism is. So they think that they're saying that there is no such thing as consciousness, but that's not what they're saying. They're saying that your idea of what you think consciousness is actually the problem. And I think you were touching on that slightly. I mean, the way people are perceiving this problem seems to be the problem.
Yeah. I mean, so if you put it like that, then I'm happy to agree. I just think it's odd to say consciousness is an illusion. There's no
I think framing that
I mean,
question.
consciousness is an everyday term. I mean, but of course, when you press somebody like Keith or Dan Dennett, rest his soul, uh, it turns out that underneath they're really no different from kind of reductive physicalists like me. No, they don't want to say we're never conscious. They just want to say a certain idea of consciousness is a mistake. And there I agree with them. In fact, I think I'm probably rather more radical than some illusionists in my skepticism about a science of consciousness. Consciousness is a thing that we can investigate. But
Would you describe it as Mysterianist in that sense, or would you
no,
rather
no, no.
term
I,
like
I, I don't think there's anything there that we
they cannot
can't
explain at some point?
understand. I think our concepts are too mushy to frame precise scientific questions, but it's not that in reality there's something there that we don't have access to. I think that's completely wrong.
Yeah, I think that's exactly how I feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're pretty much on the same page with it, and I think that's why illusionism was so attractive to me, was because I saw it the way we're talking about it now. And Keith slowly says his view's still the same. However, I think he realizes that saying illusion of consciousness might not be the best way to approach it. And I think that's where someone like Nicholas Humphrey, who calls it phenomenal surrealism, seems to be a better term. So rather say, instead of saying it's an illusion, say it's surreal, it's something completely different, but not what we think it is.
Yes, it's interesting. I don't think Keith or Dennett were ever really definite about exactly which aspect of the philosophical idea of consciousness they felt they wanted to reject. I mean, a lot of the time, Keith, and this is following Dennett, pick on the idea that colors and shapes are there in your conscious mind, and then it's very keen on getting you to form an after image of the American flag, and then say, look, you think there's some whatever the reverse of red is, there's some green there, but there's not. There's no green anywhere, and so it's an illusion that there's green, uh, and maybe that's one aspect of ordinary thinking about consciousness, but I'm not sure that's an important part of the everyday idea of consciousness. I mean, if you ask people in the street, if you could get them to focus on the question, do you think that when you see something square, there's some squareness in your mind, that inside your mind there's something square? I mean, I think if you've got them to focus on the question, they'd probably say, no, that's silly. Why would anybody think that? And that's the thing that Dennett and Keith object to the most. And so, I mean, they're quite right to object, but to move on from that to say, and therefore consciousness is an illusion, as people normally understand consciousness, that seems to me an extra step, which I don't agree with.
Mm. I think the main part that they were trying to cover was this, was people believing this is some sort of ethereal essence like entity, almost like the Ian Vital. They, I think that was the core focus, at least for Dennett's part, because for people to believe that, it's almost like admitting there is a soul, or this is some sort of mystical,
Yeah,
magical
but
phenomenon.
that's straight up dualist idea,
Yeah,
right? And if that's what we're objecting to, then all physicalists are illusionists, which is not how Keith
yeah,
and Dan present it. They present themselves as somehow being more radical than the physicalists. But all physicalists agree there's no extra thing like a vital spirit. That's a dualist idea that we're trying to get away from.
yeah. I guess would you consider then an emergentism, a very strong emergentism, to perhaps fall into that category?
I I think the term emergentism muddied the water. I mean, I've been in this business quite a long time now, and we all struggle through the 70s and 80s and 90s, looking at different kinds of non-reductive physicalism and supervenience and global supervenience and so on. And we got clear about what was a dualist position and what was a physicalist position without talking about emergence. And if if uh, if there's nothing in the mind that's over and above the physical stuff, if the physical stuff metaphysically guarantees the mental stuff, then you're a physicalist. If you think there's a possible worlds in which you have all the physical stuff and you don't have the mental stuff, then you're a dualist. And that's all nice and clear. And then people come along and say, well, it emerges, right? It emerges. And you think, hang on, well, does emergence mean that there's something guaranteed by the physical stuff that maybe can't be defined in physical terms, i.e., weak emergence, which is just a version of physicalism? Or does it mean there's something that's not guaranteed by the physical stuff at all, i.e., dualism? And that's what people call strong emergence. So I don't think it helps to bring in the term emergence. And when we start pressing, it turns out weak emergence is just physicalism allowing that you can't necessarily define anything in strictly physical terms, i.e., non-reductive physicalism, and strong emergence is just dualism. So, I mean, maybe I'm missing something. You can tell me.
No, I think you're covering it quite well. It's been about 22 years since you wrote Thinking About Consciousness.
I guess.
Yeah, it's been that's 2002. Yes. So between then and now, how have your thoughts on consciousness changed, if they have in any way?
Good. Not very much.
It's a wonderful book, by the way. Just for everyone watching or listening, they can read it. I'll put a link to it as well.
Thank you very much. Not very much at all. In fact, Tim Crane emailed me. In fact, did he email me? I think he texted me a week or two ago saying, "Look, what's your most up-to-date thing on the arguments of physicalism and the phenomenal concept strategy?" And I thought, I looked at looked in my website, see what I've written. I thought, okay, I haven't written very much about that since the book, and so I said, I think the best thing I've written on the arguments of physicalism is still in that book, and I've changed my mind on some details. I wrote a long paper on phenomenal concepts, and I think I was thinking about them in a bad way in the book. I now don't think of them as demonstrative concepts or quotational concepts. I think of them as more just recognitional concepts. So that's one thing I'm different about. A strong theme in the book is the thing we've touched on already, the extent to which people are inclined to think in dualist terms when they don't realize it. They say they're physicalists, but really they're thinking in dualist terms and generating problems for themselves by thinking in dualist terms. And in the book and in my early writing, I had a specific theory of why that was, which I called the antipathetic fallacy. I said, when you think of a mental state subjectively in terms of what it's like, it feels very different from thinking about it as a physical state, and somehow the way your two ways of thinking about it are different confuses you into thinking that what you're thinking about is different. And now I'm not so sure that that's the right explanation of what I call the intuition of dualism, intuition of distinctness. And I'm open to, why should there be one explanation? There's maybe lots of reasons that pressure people into thinking in dualist ways. So I'm a bit different on that. And I think I had Kripke wrong in the book, along with everybody else. I took Kripke to be a special case of what's called the two-dimensional argument against physicalism. And I now think that's clearly not what Kripke was up to. And I've written a couple of papers about how to understand Kripke's argument. I think it's a very interesting argument. So, I mean, but as you can see, these are kind of quite specific technical points of detail. The main thing of the book I'm still pretty keen on, especially the bit at the end, which is kind of added on to all my engagement with the technical literature on consciousness, which is arguing that our notion of consciousness, Ned Block's notion of phenomenal consciousness, is not a very precise notion. It's vague or indeterminate. It's not sufficiently focused to tell us whether lobsters are conscious. I mean, it's not that we're ignorant about whether lobsters are conscious. It's not sufficiently focused for there to be a fact of the matter about whether lobsters are conscious. I mean, maybe that's an interesting way to put my somewhat illusionist, anti-realist view about consciousness. I think asking whether, did I say octopuses or lobsters? I'm jumping back and forth.
I think you said lobsters.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
People worry about whether we can mistreat lobsters, whether we can boil them alive. And they say, oh, well, if they're not conscious, it'll be all right. If they are conscious, it would be terrible. So we've got to find out whether they're conscious. And I think that's a mug's game. I don't think you are going to find out whether they're conscious, because what you're really asking is, do they have states like these ones, the ones I have when my eyes are open and I'm awake? And in truth, they have states that are like that in some respects and not like that in many other respects. And there's no fact of the matter about whether they're conscious. I don't think it follows that there's no fact of the matter about how you should treat them. I mean, that's something we're working on at the moment. And so I think the questions of animal welfare, and in the future, AI welfare, should be addressed directly. Find out about lobsters, find out about how complex they are, find out about what kinds of projects they pursue and so on. And on that basis, you can figure out whether it's okay to mistreat them, in what ways you can treat them.
It's almost
but
like
don't try and decide first whether they're conscious. You're going off on an unhelpful detour.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to figure out almost intelligence at that point. What kind of intelligences are they showing via the behavior, what they're doing? So it's not necessarily about consciousness at this point. We're actually talking about more, are they showing intelligent life and interactivity with the world?
Good. So, but when we talk about intelligence, it's perfectly clear that this is going to come in degrees. If you want a yes/no answer to, are lobsters intelligent, you really aren't going to get it. It's a pretty open-ended concept. You can specify what level of intelligence they have, but it's not a yes/no thing. And then, having figured out what level of intelligence they have, you can figure out how you should treat them. But when it comes to consciousness, people are inclined to think about it differently. They think, oh no, consciousness. Now there's a yes/no question. Now there's the question of, does the light come on in the lobsters? And I think, are they conscious is just like asking, are they intelligent? I mean, how much of a point of view do they have? How far do they have a project? How far do they distinguish themselves from the rest of the world? Think of themselves as, I mean, clearly in some sense they do. And so Jonathan Birch at the LSE, just across the road from me in London, has just wrote this very fine book, which I spent a lot of time talking to him about before he published it, called The Edge of Sentience. And it's about animal welfare, but he hinges the whole debate on, we've got to figure out whether they're conscious. And then he says, it's kind of hard to be sure, so we should err on the side of caution. So let's look at all the things they do, and that's some indication that they're conscious. Therefore, we should treat them. We should take their interests into account in thinking about how to treat them. And I think he gets to the right answer, but he's taken this unhelpful detour through the question of, are they conscious, which I don't think adds anything.
I think it's such a slippery slope to have that discussion, because when I think about, let's say if you're a panpsychist, an idealist, if you think either everything is conscious or everything has an element of consciousness, you tend to have certain different moral and ethical views. But if you're a physicalist and you're trying to find a specific aspect when something switches on, or if the light switches on and off, you're placed in such a weird ethical dilemma, and your behavior has to somehow show that you believe this in some way. Uh, I think a good approach would be to assume everything is intelligent in varying degrees, and
Yeah.
then try to treat them in specific ways. And give you an example: ancient cultures, when they would kill an animal or eat a certain meal, they'd do a prayer around it, sort of have a ritual around this thing to sort of show appreciation for this intelligence, and know, and then fully acknowledge that you've done something to it.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm also not good, not giving any ethical advice for everyone who's gonna shit on me in the comments.
So I'm slightly curious about panpsychism. I mean, you read off from panpsychism that they will regard
Mm. To have sort of proto-conscious
all
element.
life, and not just all life, all
All things.
reality deserving of moral respect. I mean, I don't think they'd be too quick to draw that consequence, would they? I mean, it's not like stones uh, need to be, their moral interests need to be considered. So they're going to have to bring in some other level of kind of morally significant consciousness on top of their panpsychism. But
Mm. True. What are your thoughts on the fact that panpsychism does seem to be growing at a steady
uh,
rate? Or do you believe?
you know, I'm just trying to get into phone. I think it's all perverse, uh, and where's the mistake? I mean, they have to assume something
Mm.
that I find very difficult to take seriously, which is that after you've specified how things behave, how all the things in the world interact, you specify the laws, the shape of the laws that govern the world, then there's a further question about which properties, as it were, as it's sometimes put, breathe fire into the equations, which properties play these law-like roles, these nomological roles.
Mm.
So they're all committed to the view that the properties are separate from the behavior. So, I mean, they're committed to the view that there could be a world just like this world in which you have material bodies and you subject them to forces, they accelerate to a certain degree, but in which the role of resistance to acceleration isn't played by mass, but by some different quantity, smash. And so their idea is the laws don't fix the properties. And that seems to me crazy. A world that's just like this world and bodies are characterized by a quantity that measures their resistance to acceleration and measures their gravitational charge and so on, but in which that quantity isn't mass but something else. That's not another world. That's just the same world once more.
Mm.
So their whole position is built on the assumption that even after you've got the behavior all fixed, there's a further question of what comes in to, as it were, play the behavior,
Mm.
play the roles. And the reason they're attracted to this position is because they take it that zombies are possible. They take it that it's possible that there could be a world physically just like this world, but in which there's no consciousness.
Mm.
And their story about how that's possible. Okay, we'll have a world just like this world. Everything behaves the same way, but in that world, the law-like roles are filled by something different. They're filled by something that doesn't involve consciousness. And the whole thing is, don't want to be rude because I've got some psychics friends and students who are serious people, but I think the whole thing is metaphysically silly. And uh, and it's motivated by the conviction that conscious goings on are extra to the physical goings on. And I don't think that conviction has any good argumentative basis. I think that's just the dualist intuition once more. And so they're starting from the dualist intuition and they're appealing to this weird metaphysical assumption to fill it out. And it's all very strange. I mean, they fill out the dualist assumption in this metaphysically weird way because they respect the causal completeness of physics, because they don't think that interactive dualism is a serious possibility. So, okay, you asked me what do I think about panpsychism. I've just given you my rant on
I think
panpsychism.
I've, I've
It's all mismotivated, misconceived.
initially when I first used to think about this, I also I really outright rejected it. Thought it was completely ridiculous. But then there's certain scientists and philosophers, more scientists actually, who are slowly convincing me more and more of these proto elements of not consciousness, but because of this non-binary distinction of what is intelligent and what is not, it's easy to see how levels of intelligence levels of intelligence
Oh,
can increase and almost like a spectrum. So it becomes quite easy to then say that it's easy to think that we are just part of the spectrum with experience, and there is no on and off switch. So in that sense, would a version of panpsychism that considers everything in the spectrum count?
so one of the most recent things I wrote about consciousness was the problem of consciousness in the Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of Consciousness, edited by Uriah Kriegel. And I ended up there saying, I'm not really sure we have any need for the notion of phenomenal consciousness. We can define access consciousness and maybe kind of various
Mm.
functional processes in the brain. You might think these are, roughly what we refer to when we talk about conscious states. And do we need this extra idea of phenomenal consciousness? And then I said, partly motivated by Peter Godfrey Smith's recent work, that uh, what's really going on is we're having organisms that increasingly uh, have bodies and act. And once you act, you have to distinguish between yourself and your environment. You have to distinguish between interactions with the environment that are due to your actions as opposed to something coming and bumping into you. It's very important if you're an agent to be able to make that distinction. And so once you have organisms that act, they will have a perspective on reality. They'll distinguish between themselves and the rest of reality. And then you have more and more complicated cognitive systems. And I said, look, we don't need anything to get consciousness other than the physical processes playing a certain role for uh, for subjects, for beings that have a perspective on reality. And and I said, well, it's a bit like panpsychism. We've got all this physical stuff, and then we don't need anything extra to
Yeah,
make it.
exactly.
We just need it to be arranged in the right way. But uh, so
That's exactly what I was trying to hint
Yeah,
at.
and the panpsychist got rather excited, but I said no, I'm not thinking
Because it's not
thinking.
only Peter's work.
I think it does require the subjects to be there. I mean, otherwise, uh,
I look at Michael Levin's work, Carl Frist, and these people who are also doing these work. They also sort of showing that it could just be the spectrum-like thing, and then you
yeah,
don't necessarily need this word phenomenal consciousness. We're all technically having different, varying experiences that don't necessarily need to be termed.
yeah. So I think the famous Ned Block paper has been an unfortunate influence,
Got us down a rabbit hole.
and and I've just been recently writing something very much orientated to the issue of moral standing and arguing against the idea that consciousness is the key to moral standing. So, and I said, look, people who think that consciousness is the key to moral standing, they really are thinking in terms of phenomenal consciousness, and they want to get a good theory of phenomenal consciousness. So I said, let's go back and look at how Ned Block actually introduced the idea of phenomenal consciousness. As I mean, he defines access consciousness, states that are available for action control and self-report in organisms that can report and so on. And then he said, that's one thing, that's all functional definition, but I want to talk about phenomenal consciousness. And then you wait for him to define that. And he says, I can't define it. I mean, I think I'm almost quoting, in any remotely non-circular way. All we can do is point to the states which we know to be phenomenally conscious. So, I mean, it's quite explicit there that he's saying states like these, and he's pointing to the human states that we normally recognize as conscious. And in the paper, it's on my website. I mean, it's work in progress. It's not published yet. It's called "Consciousness is Not the Key to Moral Standing." I point out that the states that we point to, the ones that paradigmatically conscious, share quite a lot of different features, and the trouble is that once you move beyond human beings, these features come apart. So there are features like being introspectively available and interacting with conditioning in various ways and playing a certain role in action control, and involving in humans certain kind of feedback loops between the cortex and the thalamus and so on. And okay, so it states like those. And now we go to organisms that don't have a cortex. Are their states enough like ours to be like ours or not? And in fact, Peter Carruthers, in his recent book on consciousness and animal welfare, I mean, takes very much the line that I take. And also Francois Camara has got a paper against thinking of moral welfare in terms of consciousness. And Peter has this analogy between, yeah, okay, there's a nice neighborhood, like where do you live? Do you live in Rondebosch? Is Rondebosch still a nice neighborhood?
No, it actually is. It's not bad.
Okay.
You seem to be very familiar with Cape Town. Great.
And he says, well, we said, we can agree that certain places are nice, and then we go to another neighborhood and we start disagreeing. Is it a nice neighborhood? And it turns out, well, what we meant by nice neighborhood is, it's got Lani shops. So can I speak Afrikaans?
Yes.
Yeah. And not too much litter and so on, and smart houses. And now we go to a neighborhood that's got some of those things and not others. And is it still a nice neighborhood? And he points out, look, I mean, we never laid down exactly what the criteria for being a nice neighborhood were. I mean, there's a lot of factors, and when we get somewhere that has some of them and not others, there's no fact of the matter of whether it's a nice neighborhood. And he says it's exactly the same. There's no fact of the matter about whether lobsters are conscious. They've got some features in common with the states we point to, and not others. And
yeah. I completely agree with it. I love that analogy because it's true. When I think about a city, if we had to consider Cape Town a city and then I compare it to where I was born and where I was raised in KwaZulu-Natal, in Durban, it's not the same. So if you're talking about safety, I think about like Cape Town's the safest place you can be in South Africa. The rest of the place, sometimes it's almost as if Cape Town's another country on its own in South Africa.
yeah.
Could have like a Cape Town Brexit type thing happening here at some point.
So you don't know? I grew up for 10 years in Durban.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
No idea. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I went to DHS, Durban High School.
Wow.
And,
this has turned out to be
and Howard College, University of UKZ. ZN,
Um,
University of Natal as it was then.
I
And
did my internship there at well, and not at the university, but at the hospital that's associated with it, King Edward Hospital.
yeah, very good, very
Crazy,
good.
David. That's quite cool. So so look, Durban. I grew up in Durban, and it's very different from Cape Town. So
It's
if we
very interesting place. For people who aren't South African, Durban's very vibrant because it's ethnically very mixed. I mean, it's African Zulus and Indian heritage people and Europeans and
there's
about
millions of us Indians,
same
there's
number
so
of
many of
English.
us. I think Durban
Yeah,
is the highest population within a city. I think, except for maybe London, with
yeah.
which is crazy. I think
So
the
it's a very vibrant place as a result. Yeah,
very multicultural. I used to speak Zulu a little bit when I was younger. I can't anymore.
yeah.
I've lost that skill.
Okay.
But anyway, to get back to it, when we think about um, these definition problems, because now we're fundamentally talking about things like, okay, we've got someone who says there's an explanatory gap. We've got Thomas Nagel who says it's the what is it like, this qualitative qualia, this essence like property. And then we've got Chalmers who's talking about a hard problem versus the easy problem. It all comes down to the same thing. If you think about the easy problems, are they really easy? I mean, is it really something we should say is an easy problem? Or if we just solve each easy problem, are we technically solving the hard problem indirectly?
So I think they're just easy problems. Easy problems aren't that easy, and sometimes uh, they might be uh, not really soluble because we're posing them using mushy, vague concepts. I mean, like, what is intelligence? What is creativity? I mean, you find people studying creativity. It drives me crazy. I mean, nobody knows what we mean by creativity. You can, ants can be creative sometimes, and Einstein and Da Vinci are creative. I mean, well, I think there's one thing there, mushy concepts. So, but but we don't feel there's some deep difficulty uh, in studying intelligence or memory, or I mean, all the things that Chalmers thinks are easy problems. I agree about that. So I'm happy to call the easy problems easy, putting to one side this issue of ill-defined concepts. What I'm much more suspicious of is the idea that there's a hard problem, and I don't know if you've gone into this. I mean, it's not always clear exactly what the hard problem is. So sometimes Chalmers in the original book says, look, there's easy problem, and they're all to do with uh, functionally defined concepts like intelligence, memory, and so on. And then we have phenomenal concepts, these special concepts where we think about conscious states, not in terms of what they do, but in terms of what they feel like. And the hard problem is to figure out, what do phenomenal concepts refer to? Now, if that's what the hard problem is, they're all the orthodox a posteriori physicalists who recognize phenomenal concepts, think that the Mary thought experiment shows that we have special ways of thinking about our conscious states, kind of thinking about them directly. We can discuss how phenomenal concepts work, but we somehow use those states to think about the self same states, or we kind of point to our own states in some way. So these spatial concepts, which aren't functional concepts, don't characterize the states in terms of what they do. But a posteriori physicalists have a whole lot of stories about how those concepts refer to physical brain states. They're just a special way of thinking about physical brain states. And if that's the hard problem, figuring out what do phenomenal concepts refer to, I say it's been solved by a posteriori physicalism.
Mm.
Then you'll find Chalmers switching around and saying, no, the issue was to explain, how does the brain give rise to phenomenal consciousness? So now we're not talking phenomenal concepts, we're talking about reality. And there's this idea that the brain gives rise to phenomenal consciousness. And if you want to put it like that, I'll say, I just reject that problem. I don't think brain does give rise to phenomenal concept consciousness. That's that question presupposes dualism.
Yes.
You're presupposing that there's something extra over and above the brain processes, and we physicalists reject that assumption. So we think the hard problem is ill posed. So uh,
What do you mentioned Mary's um, room experiment. I spoke to Frank Jackson on via email. We're still hopefully going to chat at some point because he's
yeah,
changed. He spoke about the fact that this. Okay, he gives the example of Mary's room and exiting. What does she experience? Something new? Yes or no? And then apparently it changed afterwards. So I want to dissect as to why this happened to him. But what are your thoughts on the experiment in general?
uh, I can tell you what happened with Frank, but
Yeah, I think so.
uh,
Do that as well.
I think, as does nearly everybody else in this business, that the Mary thought experiment is a knockdown argument establishing the existence of phenomenal concepts and refuting what used to be called a priori physicalism. So there used to be the idea, and it was the standard view among physicalists until the Mary thought experiment, that think Wittgenstein, think logical behaviorism, that our only concepts of mental states were concepts of states that played a certain functional role. So our concept of pain was our concept of something inside you that's caused by damage and gives rise to avoidance behavior. Our concept of the experience of seeing red is something inside you might make you feel a bit jangled, is caused by ripe tomatoes and so on. Our only way of thinking about mental states is in terms of their causes and effects, basically. And that was the standard view. And on that view, the idea that there could be a being who was physically just like me, but had no consciousness, was rejected as conceptually impossible. I mean, if it walks like me and it talks like me, well, then it feels like me. That was the idea, because all our concepts of feelings were concepts of states that made you behave a certain way. So that used to be the standard view. And I take the Mary thought experiment to be a knockdown refutation of that view, because if that was the view, then Mary wouldn't learn anything when in any sense, she wouldn't in any sense learn something when she has the experience caused by looking at ripe tomatoes. And
And
it seems to me pretty obvious, and to nearly everybody else, wonderful thought experiment, that of course she learns something. Here she is, she's a scientist, she knows all about wavelengths and people having color experience. She's never had them. She can talk about the green color experience and the red color experience, I mean, in terms of the wavelengths and things that cause them. And now she comes and has the experience, and she discovers that the thing caused by red tomatoes is this one and not the one that's caused by grass. And I mean, you can see from her point of view, it could have been the other way around. I mean, she's learned something she didn't know before. And you've got to accept that. And of course, we physicalists say, oh, well, she's only learned something new at the level of concepts. She's acquired a new way of thinking about red experiences. And because she didn't have this new way of thinking before, she didn't previously know that ripe tomatoes cause this, and now she kind of uses her phenomenal concept, and now she knows that. So but she always knew that ripe tomatoes caused neural oscillations Y in the visual cortex 4, and she always knew that. And now she knows that ripe tomatoes call this, and all we physicalists say is, well, so she's got a new concept for an old thing. I mean, she's got a new concept. I'm expressing it by this, and it refers to just the same thing as her old concept, oscillations Y in V4 referred to. So, I mean, as my friend Tim Craig, two concepts, one thing. Philosophers love that. They love that, two concepts, one thing. And that's what we a posteriori physicalists say. And everybody, not just the physicalists, but also nearly all dualists think, yeah, there's phenomenal concepts. Mary gets a new phenomenal concept. The difference is that the dualists think phenomenal concepts refer to something extra and non-physical, whereas the physicalists think the phenomenal concepts refer to something physical. Okay. Now, but you're curious about what happened to Frank.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I have an idea, but I'd love to hear your
Okay,
version.
let me fill out the story.
Mm.
So we've got everybody agreeing there's phenomenal concepts. But the physicalists say, look, they refer to physical things. And the dualists say, no, they refer to some extra special conscious mind stuffy thing. And it's clear enough that the fact that the Mary thought experiment shows us these extra concepts does not in itself establish that they refer to something non-physical. But then the dualists, and I'm thinking especially here, David Chalmers, Frank Jackson, various others, say, there's something special about phenomenal concepts that means that they can't refer to physical things. And now we get the whole business of two-dimensional semantics and the fact that phenomenal concepts don't refer by description, they somehow refer directly. And the crucial two-dimensional assumption is in effect that terms that refer directly are not just semantically direct, they don't refer by description, but are also epistemologically direct. They will reveal all the essential features of their referent to you a priori. And then, this is simplifying the two-dimensional argument, but in a way that's fair to it. So the idea is that phenomenal concepts are special, they refer directly, so they should be epistemologically revelatory. If what they're referring to is by its nature physical, you ought to be able to see that what you're thinking about is physical, but you can't, so it can't be physical. And that's the two-dimensional argument. And Frank is very committed to that way of thinking about semantics and epistemology. And what's his nice book from 25 years ago, From Concepts to Metaphysics, I think. Anyway, so he has the Mary argument that gives you phenomenal concepts, and then the two-dimensional semantics that takes you from phenomenal concepts to dualism. Okay. And he got to dislike dualism because he always believed in the causal closure of the physical. He thought that if there were these extra dualist states, they'd have to be epiphenomenal. He started to think that epiphenomenalism looks more and more horrible. So normal people would say, yes, you've established phenomenal concepts, and if you buy two-dimensionalism, you're going to be moved to dualism, epiphenomenalism. So you better give up the two-dimensionalism. But Frank was really attached to the two-dimensionalism, so he gave up the Mary argument. Yeah. And he's like the only person who doesn't believe in the Mary argument. I mean, I'll tell you who else doesn't believe in the Mary argument is Dennett. Dennett never believed in the Mary argument because he was always a logical behaviorist. And
Dennett studied under a behaviorist, a very famous one as well.
Yeah, Ryle. Yeah, absolutely. And he never gave up his Rylean commitments in that way. So,
another thing I often think about, because when I was writing about it, when I spoke about the Mary room, the knowledge argument, I thought about the fact that, and it's also not the same experience that everyone's going to have. So just like goes back to what we were talking about earlier, if every person was a separate Mary, let's say, whatever they all first see for the first time is not going to be the same anyway. So it's not like there is a distinct, solid thing that is going to be experienced here. This is still also a very blurry spectrum of different encounters.
Yeah, I'm not sure that matters too much. And I agree. I mean, the psychology, psychophysics here is very interesting. You know, when you're a kid, do people all see the same colors when they're looking at the same thing? And
Mm.
you think that, or you know, if you're a Wittgensteinian, you think it's a silly private language you're thinking about. But in fact, the scientific evidence is that people do see different things. They do have different experiences when they're looking at the same things. And I mean, do you know experiments on seeing pure colors? I mean, can you see a, a pure yellow without any
Mm.
red or green in? And it's a quite distinct experience. People can tune and tell you when they're seeing pure yellow. And it turns out that different people see pure yellow looking at different things.
Yeah.
Uh, so, you know, you and I will look at the same yellow book, and one of us will have one experience, somebody else. I mean, there's quite a lot of interpersonal variation. But I don't think that really matters for the philosophical arguments. And
Mm.
the reason is that with the Mary experiment, we're thinking of my phenomenal concept of
Yes.
the experience I have when I look at the yellow book. It's a rather specific phenomenal concept.
Yeah. It is in essence an
We,
individual
we shouldn't
experience.
assume that it's the same, refers to the same thing as the concept you form when you look at the same book.
Mm.
The concept we were talking about earlier was the concept of the generic concept of phenomenal consciousness as such. And
Mm.
you might wonder how that generic concept relates to the specific concepts we have of this or that kind of experience. And that's an interesting question in
Mm.
itself. But I don't think the fact that different people will form differently referring phenomenal concepts in response to the same physical object is
Mm.
the same point as the concept of phenomenal consciousness is a bit mushy and indeterminate. And I think
Yes.
they're
No, I
same
agree
point.
with you. I think that the fact that everyone's having a different experience doesn't necessarily rule out the fact that that's a possibility. But you're right, because I did come at it from a very psychological one, because mine was exploring the different experiences of psychiatric patients, even
Uh-huh.
discussing things like the philosophical and the zombie argument. And if you
Mhm.
try and talk about whether we're talking about someone who's a philosophical zombie, we have psychological zombies everywhere all the time. When you take a schizophrenic patient or a psychotic patient, you have no idea whether their sense of reality is
Yeah.
anything remotely close to what you experience, especially if they're acutely psychotic. So the question
Yeah.
comes in, does that count as a philosophical zombie? Is there some sort of an argument that could be made that this is not a conscious person? What if their conscious experience is that they are dead and not conscious? You have to start asking all these weird questions, because these are some experiences people have: derealization, feeling like death,
So, so, so what's the syndrome when people think they're dead? That's got a name,
Cotard
hasn't it?
syndrome. Cotard syndrome.
Yeah. And
And that's fascinating, because if I,
I mean, it's not quite the same as saying they're not conscious, but it is. I'm not conscious part. I mean,
there,
is that part of the
there's
Carlson
certain
syndrome?
different, no, there are certain different psychiatric conditions where people do fundamentally believe. I don't think there's certain names for them, but they're so derealized to a point where they become blurred into reality with everything else, lose a sense of self firstly. So there's no sense of self anymore. And then
Right.
thereafter, there is no sense of consciousness, because they feel so immersed with reality in a very different way than we can perceive or talk
See.
about in ordinary
Yeah.
language. But it's similar to
Yeah.
someone taking an experimental trip with shrooms. I guess at
Yeah.
that point, this altered state of consciousness is
Yeah.
quite.
But it would seem odd to say that they're not conscious. I mean, by
Yeah,
all means.
it would be very strange, because there's still something being experienced, and in essence, therefore, something is conscious. But then,
Good.
what is it? Where is it?
Yes.
If you Okay, David, if you had to think of, okay, what consciousness most likely is, how would you
Yeah.
define that? Because we've spoken very much about what it's not.
Right. So I don't know.
Me
Uh,
too.
and
But isn't I think that's the best
so,
answer.
so you're pressing me here, and I've never quite addressed this question in the way I am No, but I've been saying that the concept phenomenal consciousness is mushy. It's a multi-criterion concept, and it doesn't really uh, tell us what to say when the criteria come apart in different organisms. And I'm not sure we need a notion that refines away the equivocation. I mean, we have a notion of access consciousness, things that you can introspectively identify. We have a notion of things that play a certain role in action control. We have a notion of things that allow certain kinds of associative conditioning and so on. And these things tend to uh, overlap, coincide in human beings. And I don't think there's anything more to say. I don't think there is a definite thing, consciousness, apart from these various different kind of functional definitions of different states, which are pretty tightly correlated in human beings and clearly come apart in different animals. We have cases where they come apart in human beings. I mean, you think of all the net block generated stuff about cognitive overflow. We've got these states at the back of the brain that have a lot of information in, and then we have these states at the front of the brain that we can report, and which of those are really the conscious states? And I'm not sure it's a serious debate. The ones in the front of the brain are accessible. The ones in the back of the brain carry a lot of information that can be used elsewhere. And if you look at that debate, you'll find people trying to argue that, well, there's certain things you can't explain if you think the consciousness is only in the front of the brain and not at the back of the brain, or vice versa.
Mm.
And you think, hang on, if you plonk the consciousness here or there, why does that give you different explanations? Surely in brain processing terms, we explain things in terms of brain processes that have certain causes and effects. And the idea that deciding which of those states is conscious is going to give you some extra explanatory payoff, that looks weird to me. But that seems to be a presupposition of this whole debate. So, look, I think this whole business of trying to identify consciousness, either in scientific terms or in philosophical terms, is misguided. It's generated by implicit dualist thinking, the idea that there's some extra thing there over and above the brain processes. But
Mm.
having said that, I have serious colleagues who don't make any of the mistakes that I'm accusing the general kind of consciousness industry of making. And they say, no, don't prejudge the fact that we might well find an important scientific category that coincides with consciousness of human beings and is of some explanatory importance. And I don't want to rule that out. It may just pan out like that. But I'm not optimistic, and I don't see any a priori reasons for supposing it has to pan out like that.
Mm. David, are you familiar with Michael Graziano's work?
Uh, I'm just trying to remember.
He,
Remind me.
so when I think it was in 2018, Keith published a journal called Illusionism as a Theory of Consciousness, and he got a group of writers to contribute to it. Some of them was Nicholas Humphrey, Daniel Dennett, Francois Camera, you spoke about him earlier, Susan Blackmore, Dirk Pierboom, and one of them was Michael Graziano, because he's got what is known as the attention schema theory.
Right.
And the whole purpose of this gathering of these different thinkers was to do exactly what you're talking about right now, is to show people that the framing of these problems is fundamentally the problem,
Yeah.
is where the problem really lies. It's not that they're saying consciousness doesn't exist. It's more that we're just searching for the wrong thing.
Right.
And I think you would have been perfect in that catalog, just as
Yeah, yeah.
but Michael's work specifically, when you look into the neuroscience behind his work, it's easy to see why we do this, which is why I think you should actually check it out because it's fascinating. His attention schema theory sort of indicates why we tend to have this thought that there is this essence-like quality in this experience due to certain heuristic adaptations, biological adaptations, which are useful but not necessarily accurate. And yeah, there's a whole lot of work. I don't want to butcher his work, but at some point, I think you should check it out.
But you might well wonder how are these issues going to be decided? I mean, I've been saying that the concept of consciousness is mushy. Let me come at the problem from a different end. If you think about the standard way of testing the theories of consciousness in humans, I don't know, global workspace theory, perceptual reality monitoring, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You have some theory. You say, look, here are these processes in the brain. I'll give you a characterization of them, and I say those are the conscious ones, right? And now we test it by finding people who have those processes going on and saying, were you conscious? And all finding people who lack those processes and checking whether they say, oh, no, I wasn't conscious, I mean, of the relevant thing. So by the nature of the methodology, we seem to be equating consciousness with access consciousness. It's conscious if and only if subjects can report the state.
Mm.
Okay, but then we're told by Ned Block and others, oh, no, let's not be too quick. Let's not assume that phenomenal consciousness coincides with access consciousness, right? And okay, fair enough. I mean, access consciousness is one thing, and these people have in mind that there's something that mightn't properly overlap with that. But now, what are the rules for deciding the game? I mean, how are we to? I mean, I've got a theory. I mean, you know, integrated information, it's all over the place. I say that's consciousness. Eva Jablonka says unlimited associative learning, that's consciousness. And, it's there in some animals. How are we supposed to decide which of these theories is right?
Mm. So Susan Blackmore calls that delusionism.
What's delusionism?
She refers to the fact that we constantly. Let me just first think about this before I incorrectly define this. So delusionism is the fact that we walk around thinking that we are conscious most of the time. So she quotes Marvin Minsky by saying, we think that we'll never make a computer that is conscious or aware of what it's doing, but then again, we rarely are ourselves. So and I'm paraphrasing that quote. So she brings up the fact that you don't really think about whether you're conscious unless you stop and ask yourself, am I conscious right now? So
right.
For the most part, you're just walking around on autopilot, driving your car home, doing whatever you have to do. And then there are varying moments in the day where you finally think, okay, am I conscious now? And she says that's a part of the illusion problem that Keith and them were talking about. But then there's this delusional problem where we still think, even though we know we're not conscious most of the time, that we still tend to think we are all the time. And that's a fundamental problem, which again goes back to the psychology of it all.
But is she assuming there that, I mean, it sounds like she's assuming something like in a current higher order theory of consciousness, which I don't think many people assume, that i.e., the state is only conscious if you're actually thinking at a meta level, I'm having this state. And even people who like higher order theories of consciousness, which is basically equating consciousness with access consciousness, tend not to be a current higher order theorist, the dispositional higher order theorists, i.e., that you would have been able to form a higher order judgment about the state if you put your mind to it. And it's pretty clear that if you're going to be an access consciousness person, you have to be dispositional. So
she's I think more along the line of an illusionist. She does not believe that we find there, and she's not mysterious, but she does think that these finding neural correlates of consciousness is a pointless journey. We'll never really find that because there is no conscious state in the way we search for it. But that's part of the delusional mindset for this search.
Then I'm happy to be with her. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I think you guys do align in that regard. David, to sort of round off, let's say there is these states of consciousness existing and we go through life doing these. What are your thoughts on free will? Just as a segue to the end of the conversation. That's a poor segue, but
I've always been a happy compatibilist about free will. I can't really see what the people who are uneasy about compatibilism are hankering for. I mean, it's perfectly clear to me that if free will is something worth having, I'm just thinking of Dennett's All the Free Will Worth Having, it's my being able to make a change, direct what I do as a result of my character, my aims, my deliberation, and so on. And the idea that what you really want is that after all that's done its work, there's some extra bit of something that comes from outside my character and my beliefs and desires making a difference. I mean, many people have made this point before, Galen Strawson, Frederick Will, that bringing in some extra random element is no more giving me free will than what I had before. And so, no, I'm a happy compatibilist.
I would think, do you think making an active choice, sorry to interrupt, do you feel like making those choices, the very moment that we make a choice could be the essence like quality of consciousness that we're all searching for?
Not really. I think a lot of the things I would like to think I'm doing and I'm doing free without much assistance from consciousness. I'm not sure the two categories will overlap that. But let me make one final point because this is interesting for your viewers. So Dennett on free will, he says there is free will. He argues with Greg Caruso and other eliminativists about free will that look, it's not quite what you might have been hoping for. You might have been hoping for some kind of agent causality coming from outside the realm of natural law, but you aren't going to get any such thing. But what we have is our actions being directed crucially by our character, our beliefs, and desires. So that's all that you should be hankering for. That's the important thing. That's what matters. So we have free will. It's all the free will worth having. Not quite what you might have hoped for if you were a religious kind of person, but nothing wrong with it. When it comes to consciousness, it's the same story. We have mental states that we're introspectively aware of and important for our action control and so on. Not quite what the dualists thought was going on, but still there's this stuff going on inside you. But on consciousness, he doesn't say that's all the consciousness worth having. I'm in favor of consciousness. He says consciousness is an illusion. And the two setups are exactly the same. I mean, from a physicalist point of view, you get an awful lot of free will and consciousness, maybe all the things that you wanted, but not what dualist religious people would have been hoping for. And why does he go eliminativist about consciousness and non-eliminativist about free will? And I've asked him that. I asked him that there was some kind of podcast we were both on, and I said, and he said there isn't any difference. The two situations are exactly the same. And I said, so it's just rhetoric, is it, the illusionism? And he said, yeah, I guess it is. I guess it is. So
That was
we
something
have,
I often wondered as well. That's exactly what I've always thought. Well, like, how does he get to that conclusion about the other? And
yeah,
and I'm glad you actually brought that up. Thank you.
good, good.
Yeah, it's something I've often thought about because you'd assume that he'd go down the Sam Harris route with his
Yeah.
consciousness mindset. But if for some reason they just don't coincide there, unlike their religious views.
Yes, maybe it's something to do with his Gilbert Ryle logical
Mm,
behaviorism, neo-behaviorism. Uh,
mm. I also think maybe it has something to do with.
he's for free will in action, but he's against consciousness. But yeah, but in truth, his views about the two subjects are just the same, and
Mm,
I think that's I don't want to be a limitivist about either,
mm.
but it's yeah.
David, what philosophical questions really play at you at night currently?
I'm writing a book about causation, which
Mm,
is and causal inference and probability and the direction of time and things like that. And I'll tell you the one thing that really puzzles me is probability.
mm,
Uh, and I mean, we've been talking about consciousness. I said, I haven't changed my mind very much since I wrote that book 20 years ago. And on plenty of things, I've formed a view and I've been happy with it. Probability, I find I keep on changing my mind. I think it's such a deep and difficult issue. I love thinking about it. In fact, I'm writing this book about causation that involves probabilities a great deal, but I hope I can write it in such a way that it doesn't matter what you think about probability. You should agree with me what I say about causation. But
mm. What
yes,
do you have a working title for the book? What's are you
it's
allowed to
just
say?
it's going to be called causes.
Cause,
That's it. Causes.
causes. Okay, causes. Okay.
That's
No subheadings.
so. Yes, there's a book by your ex-colleague. He's no longer in Cape Town. J.M. Coetzee,
Mhm.
called Diary of a Bad Year, I think, where he has a lot. I mean, he's a fine writer and a real philosopher, if you ask me. And this book has a lot of asides of a philosophical nature, talking about free will and so. And one of them is probability. He says, "What is probability? It makes no sense." Here's this coin, I spin it, it comes down heads or it comes down tails, but it's not just one or naught. There's supposed to be this number around which is zero point 0.5, but where's this zero point 0.5 in reality? How do you get probability into reality? Uh, that's the thing that keeps me awake at night, I'm afraid.
Mm. And that goes so much deeper when you think about the way quantum mechanics works, and then probabilities play a role there. Um,
Yeah. So,
it expands into every conversation you could possibly have.
yeah, no, I think about that a great deal. And
Do you think then that because that's so misunderstood, it's either a nice way for some philosophers and scientists to pretend that consciousness comes from that, some sort of a quantum indeterminacy or some sort of probabilities within a quantum realm, or do you think that's just them trying too hard at, if you give it like a Penrose microtubules, if you go deep enough.
I mean, I'm just trying to think about bad move in philosophy is you've got one big puzzle and you've got another big puzzle.
And bring them
They're
together.
the same puzzle, right? And you looks like you made progress. You've reduced two puzzles to one, but it's just made up. I mean, you haven't reduced two puzzles to one. They're both still there.
Mm. Well, now I'm looking forward to causes. David, any final words? Anything else you think that we haven't touched on in consciousness, the mind body problem, free will, or causes that you'd like to end off?
Kevin, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and that was a lot of fun. So thank you very much. It's nice to spend time with you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. From one Durbanite to another. I can't believe it. My mind's still blown. I'm still fixated on that.
Yeah. Okay. Tot ziens.
Yeah. Cheers, David. Take care. Hope we chat again soon.
Okay. Bye, Kevin. Bye.
Bye bye.